Thank you very much. This presentation draws on a report that we did under the PASTRES program called Are Livestock Always Bad for the Planet? Presentation is essentially about cows, the climate, and justice. As you'll all know, this was a subject of really hot debate at the recent climate COP in Glasgow, and the focus of much media commentary and campaign effort around thinking about diet change, climate mitigation, and the role of livestock. And in this presentation, I want to introduce to you some debates around this and some of the challenges around the assumptions that are made in current discussions. Livestock, in many senses, have become the villains of climate change, provoking widespread demands for the reduction in livestock production, even its banning, and switches to plant-based or cultured meats or diets, particularly in the global north. Methane, what cows and other ruminants burp, has become a big issue in climate change debates. And reducing methane emissions, in particular, including from livestock, is seen as a quick win for climate mitigation. The European Union and the US launched the Global Methane Pledge at COP26, with around 100 countries signing up collectively to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. But before we race to restricting livestock production to meet climate targets, we must remember that the relationship between cows and the climate is much more complex than the media, think tanks, campaign groups, celebrities, and many others, including some on this slide, project. I want to argue in this talk that the distortions in the policy debates create major forms of injustice that development agencies, scientists, field practitioners, and others really need to address. And these injustices emerge around a number of themes. There are epistemic injustices around knowledge. There are procedural injustices around how data is reported and used in policy, and distributional injustices around who wins and who loses. The report published by PASTRES that I lead, based at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, was launched together with 13 other organizations and in support of the International Year for Rangelands and Pastoralists. It delves into the data and challenges the assumptions on which many statements are based. Its analysis focuses on a particular type of modeling, so-called life cycle assessments, used to define climate impacts, and in turn help frame climate policy in many of the media and campaign positions that we've just talked about. This form of assessment causes, we argue, distortions, and so injustices focus on some of the world's most marginalized populations, those who live in and from rangelands, pastoralists of various sorts. The type of modeling is widely used to assess the impacts of different greenhouse gases on global warming through looking at all the inputs and all the outputs from production to retail, sometimes consumption. And it's been used in a number of really important studies and influential studies to assess the impact of livestock on emissions, including the two on the right of this slide from the FAO. The figure most often repeated is that livestock contribute 14.5% to total anthropogenic emissions, mostly from methane. And that figure comes from one of those FAO reports, the one in the bottom right-hand corner. The figure is repeated again and again and has become iconic in campaigns and media commentaries, with all sorts of claims about the equivalence being made between, for example, cars and cows. Picking on one particular LCA, life cycle assessment analysis, published in the journal Science in 2018, the UK newspaper The Guardian ran the headline, "Avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on Earth." But is this really the case? And if followed through, who would be the winners and who would be the losers? We must ask, does this all apply to pastoral and other extensive livestock systems, such as those pictured in this slide from our PASTRES study sites from Tunisia, from India, from Kenya, from Sardinia in this case? The simple answer to that question is no. Pastoralists, as this audience well knows, they occupy the world's rangelands. From the Arctic tundra to the savannas of Africa, via the mountains and steppes of Europe, Asia, and Latin America. This is over half the world's land surface and involves many millions of people. Of course, they tend a huge variety of different animals, from cattle to yaks, to camels, to goats, to sheep, to reindeer, to llamas, and so on, with different emission dynamics associated with them. They supply markets and provide high density protein and key nutrients for the diets of many. And of course, they occupy areas that otherwise could not be used for agriculture, supporting millions of livelihoods across the world. And through light, mobile grazing and herding practices, they can enhance biodiversity. They can sequester carbon and nitrogen and preserve landscapes and cultural identities. Yet pastoralists and other extensive livestock producers on rangelands are often lumped together with industrial livestock producers in this debate about climate and food. But industrial livestock producers working in contained, intensive systems with imported feed, high reliance on infrastructure and transport and so on are very different. So pastoralists therefore suffer from the same policy moves to reduce livestock numbers, change diets, and enclose or rewild landscapes that were once grazing lands as a result of these debates about climate and food. So in our report, we investigate the lives of life cycle analysis models and their politics. And to cut a very long story short, such models have a number of systematic biases in data and a set of gaps and assumptions that cause major distortions, at least in the way they're currently used. And in the report, we identify 10 different biases and assumptions. Biases in the data, problems in the way systems are defined, and issues around how baselines for assessments are used. And together they consistently overestimate the impact of extensive livestock systems and underestimate their value. As I've already mentioned, a number of studies show that such systems can have a neutral or even negative carbon balance under certain conditions. And in the report, we look at cases from Sardinia in Italy, from Amdo Tibet in China, and from the Ferlo region of Senegal in West Africa. All extensive, in some cases semi-mobile, pastoral systems that have great potential for a low carbon system. So in sum, a focus on particular systems in the way that data is analyzed and presented into policy, in other words, high input intensive systems, and a failure to understand others, extensive low input systems, such as these yak grazing in Amdo Tibet in China, means that simplistic, misleading assessments about products, meat or milk, are generated. These, of course, then get published, they get repeated in the media, they get taken up by campaign organizations, celebrities and others, often in perfectly well-meaning ways, and become central to the mechanics of policy statements, measuring, reporting, verification, and so on. And this, we argue, is problematic. So let's have a look at a few examples of where the problems lie. I can't go through all of them that are in the report. You'll have to read the report for that. And why arguments that all livestock are bad for the planet are seriously misplaced. So first, global assessments are overwhelmingly based on data from industrial systems. One frequently quoted paper looking at 38,700 farms and 1,600 processors fact, only focus on what they call commercially viable units, mostly from Europe and North America. However, not all livestock are the same, meaning that global extrapolations just don't work and don't make sense. So work in Kenya by the International Livestock Research Institute, for example, shows how assumptions about emissions from African animals are often inaccurate, as such livestock are smaller, have higher quality diets due to selective grazing, and have physiologies that are adapted to their settings. They're not the same as the highly bred animal in a respiration chamber in North America or wherever, where much of the data on emission factors comes from. So overall, data from extensive systems are massively underrepresented in this wider debate. For example, a review of life cycle assessments of food production showed that only 0.4% of such studies were from Africa, where extensive pastoralism is common across large areas, as you well know. Second, most assessments focus on emission impacts per animal or per unit of product. This, we argue, creates a distorted picture as the wider costs and benefits are not taken into account. Very often, those in favor of industrialized systems point to the high per animal methane emissions from animals eating rough, low-quality forage on open rangelands, compared to the potential, at least, for improved methane-reducing feeds through additives and so on in contained systems. But of course, this misses the point, as a much wider, more integrated, holistic systems approach must encompass all impacts, but also benefits. And for extensive systems, as I've already mentioned, the benefits of their use of such environments are many. Third, methane and carbon dioxide have very different lifetimes in the atmosphere and are simply just not equivalent, despite the fact that we have to, in these life cycle assessments, create these carbon dioxide equivalent measures. Methane, of course, is a short-lived, but it's a highly potent gas, while carbon dioxide sticks around in the atmosphere effectively forever. Reducing global warming can be addressed in the short term by tackling methane emissions, but long-term climate change needs to focus on carbon dioxide. It therefore makes a big difference how different greenhouse gases are assessed and how any so-called global warming potential that puts them together is estimated, meaning that basically cows and cars are just not the same. Fourth, and finally, in my summary of these assumptions and biases, is the big question of what baseline is used really matters. So in extensive systems, livestock replace very often wild herbivores, which also emit greenhouse gases, as do many other features of extensive rangelands, termites, for example. Pastoral systems may therefore not result in additional emissions from a so-called natural baseline. Indeed, some forms of extensive grazing, as I've already mentioned, can potentially increase carbon stocks, adding to the already significant amount of carbon in open rangelands, in grasses, roots, and the soil. By contrast, industrial systems are clearly additional, adding significant emissions, as well as other impacts through the importation of feed, the concentration of waste, the costs of transport, and the implications of sunk infrastructure. Therefore, baselines really matter, and additionality on those baselines may be very different between extensive and industrialized systems. So what does all this mean for policy and practice? For the type of settings where we're working within the PASTRES project, again, pictures here from our study sites, this time in Kenya, in Amdo, Tibet, and Sardinia again. Overall, we conclude in the report, we need to distinguish always between industrial contained livestock production on one hand that has a high carbon footprint and is responsible for major land use changes around the world, and avoid lumping it in with extensive systems and pastoral production, which is very different in character. The material conditions of production, the relationships between capital, labor, the environment are radically different between industrialized and extensive systems. Meat and milk from such systems are just not the same. This is important as the current generalized narrative that we talked about right at the beginning of the talk, that all livestock are bad for the planet, results in a series of injustices, often inadvertent, but very real in their consequences. And as I mentioned before, these include epistemic injustices around knowledge through the promotion of particular models, and so particular data and associated biases. Procedural injustices through the use of such data in global assessments, verification, measurement and reporting, and distributive injustices. Effectively, pastoralists and other extensive livestock producers lose out through this generalized narrative. All these injustices are generated together. And simplistic forms of climate change advocacy by environmentalists and others will often miss their target if campaigners misunderstand and therefore misuse models and data. And this will undermine people's livelihoods and pastoralists' environments. And this is why we argue that a justice focus is essential. Science is really important, but we have to think about how science articulates with questions of distribution and justice. And this, of course, is why there is a need for a much more differentiated perspective when we're talking about global food and climate questions. And a differentiated perspective that accepts that pastoral production systems can make use of harsh rangeland environments productively, making use of variability in all its forms. They can enhance environmental values, including through carbon sequestration, and they can provide, importantly, high quality protein and other nutrients in the diets, particularly for poorer and marginalized people. So I invite you to read the report and the associated briefings and information sheets and let us know what you think. In a way, this argument will not be a surprise to this audience, but I think it is important for us to collectively engage with the science and the processes around climate change policy making, lest serious damage is done to often poor and marginalized people. This damage may not be being done on purpose by well-meaning environmentalist organizations and celebrities and others, but by default. Reducing methane is an important aim. I don't dispute that for a minute. Addressing climate change is probably the world's most fundamental challenge at the moment, but it's important to get our targets right. In respect of methane, of course, gas pipelines, large waste dumps, and industrial livestock should be the priority for methane emissions reduction. And if we lump everything together, particularly across the livestock sector, measurement, verification, and reporting mechanisms that are so central to the IPCC and the global climate change processes will be distorted. This is a rising and important agenda, and those of us who work on pastoralism, in rangelands, on wider development and food questions, it's really, really important that we engage in this now, particularly as we build up to the next COP in Egypt, where food and climate will be a central agenda. So let's make sure there's a more differentiated approach at the center of all of this. And the arguments against livestock, pushed by powerful people, powerful interests, are focused and challenged in an appropriate way. Thank you very much.